So if you have a TV show that you're watching for a number of seasons, and then someone in your family decides to join you and watch some random episode, you're on like season 3, episode 11 or something, and they sit down, what's going to happen? The most annoying thing that can happen is they just keep asking you, who's that? And what's going on? Because when you jump in to a random episode, you don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on. So I just want to say that Luke 10, this passage about Martha and her sister Mary, is not season 1, episode 1, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens before that time. But people have often used this passage. They rush to find some kind of easy moral without keeping in mind the context of Jesus' larger ministry. So some claim, for instance, that this story shows that it's better to listen than to do. And other people say that it's better to engage in contemplation than in service. And other people are sure that what it says is that worship is important, but joining causes is not. And there are those who simply see this as women pitted against each other. Mary, the ideal, quiet disciple sitting at Jesus' feet, and Martha, the hysterical woman running around doing everything who's jealous of her sister. Now, how do we know that's not a great way to read the passage? None of those are a great way to read the passage. Because we know all the things that Jesus has done and said in the Gospels. Luke and the other writers give us a wonderfully complex picture of Jesus and what he asks of people. He's not just tossing off little moralistic gems. And furthermore, he isn't asking people to shove themselves into a little box to choose one aspect of who they are and serve God with that one aspect. He's inviting whole, complicated human beings to serve God as whole, complicated human beings. So those folks who use this passage to say that Jesus only wants contemplation, not service, he wants worship and stillness, not activity, have missed a bunch of episodes in this series. For one thing, Luke himself talks a lot about Jesus in Luke. Luke depicts Jesus, I should say, as caring very deeply about service, even in this chapter. You know what story comes right before this one about Martha? The Good Samaritan. And we know the Good Samaritan is a story about enacted love, that what Jesus wants from us, sure, sometimes it's sitting at his feet, but sometimes it's being the Good Samaritan and engaging in loving activity. And specifically, Jesus has things to say about hospitality. So earlier in this chapter, he sends out 72 of his disciples, and they're supposed to go to towns and prepare, sort of till the soil so that people are ready for Jesus' message and so forth. And he instructs them, when you go into somebody's house, just eat what's before you. Accept the hospitality of people. And it's one of those things that Jesus asked them to do that he has also modeled for them, right? We have tons of stories in the Gospels where Jesus goes and eats with people. He apparently really liked to gather with people around the table. Jesus enjoyed the humble human activity of conversation around food. So much so, as you likely know, his critics called him a glutton and a drunkard. That's how much he really enjoyed partaking of food around the table with friends. And then in Luke, also a couple chapters before, we have a negative example of hospitality where Jesus goes to the house of a religious person, Simon. And Simon doesn't extend hospitality to Jesus, right? I mean, he does get to eat. But Jesus says, you didn't even give me water to wash my feet. You didn't give me a kiss of welcome. So lack of hospitality is problematic as well. So we know in Martha's case, Jesus is not knocking the importance of hospitality. He's not dissing women's work. He's not calling into question humble tasks or the people who do them. But let's look at it a little bit together, this short vignette. It starts out with Jesus traveling around the countryside and Martha welcoming him and maybe his whole entourage into her home. And I think maybe this is common. We know that Martha and Mary and Lazarus are friends of Jesus, not just acquaintances, not just random, I'm showing up at your house seeing if you're going to be faithful. Maybe Martha's house is one of those places that they always stop when they're in this region. And we see this at the end of his life. We find him visiting these friends again. We see Jesus doing the most incredible public miracle of his ministry in the context of this family, the Raisin of Lazarus. So Martha, at the opening of the story, is a model disciple. She welcomes Jesus in. And presumably, her discipleship includes endeavoring to give Jesus a beautiful meal, something that's worthy of who he is. He deserves her best. So the first question I think this passage raises for us is, how do we welcome Jesus in? What do we do to prepare? How do we clear out space for him in our lives and in our minds? And there's lots of answers that Christians have given through the ages. To be quiet, to study scripture, to engage in prayer, to journal, to paint pictures, to go on a long walk, ride your bike, buy groceries for a friend, serve soup at a soup kitchen. There's many, many ways that we prepare to welcome Jesus into our lives again. Rest so that you can receive. Serve so you can welcome Jesus. So at first we see Martha doing the right thing, welcoming Jesus into her home. She's preparing things. And then we know that Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet listening. And everybody is just kind of doing their thing until Martha complains. Jesus, she says, do you not care that my sister, well, she says, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me. And I think it's interesting to think about the kind of friendship that Martha has with Jesus, that she feels empowered to tell him what to do, right? She calls him Lord. She acknowledges who he is. She doesn't just say, hey, JC, got a task for you. She respects him, and yet she feels empowered to tell him not only what's up, but what he should do about it. And we see this in the Gospels over and over again, too. Disciples who think they need to tell Jesus how to do his ministry. Jesus, tell the people to go home because they're hungry and we don't have any food. Jesus, tell this man to stop shouting. Jesus, tell this woman to stop calling out. Right? There's just lots of times when people take it on themselves to tell Jesus. But what's, I think, comforting about this is when that happens, Jesus doesn't put them in their place with kind of like a, seriously, folks, I'm the Son of God. Like, who do you think you are? He never does that. And he doesn't chide Martha for telling him what to do either. He addresses the need underneath her words. And it kind of reminds me, I was in a youth group in my early teen years where some of the leaders got into that name it, claim it version of prayer. Maybe you've experienced it. And the idea was that we would express faith in God by demanding things from God, assuming that God wanted exactly what we want. God, heal the child. God, make it stop raining so we can go on a youth trip, etc. This made me really uncomfortable, even as a 14-year-old, because I thought I would never tell my parents what to do. I'm pretty sure I shouldn't be telling God either. But I think now the most problematic thing about this is that it assumes we know what God wants. We think that God's desires are completely aligned with our own. That's a problem. And it's not only a problem, but it, I think, is a perennial temptation. And if we look around the culture and we say, wow, the church is really going off the rails, it may be because people have confused their own desires to win a culture war or to, have prayer in school or whatever their issue is, they've confused that with God's work. To think that God's desires completely align with our own. When Martha says, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work myself? Tell her then to help me. It sounds like she knows that Jesus is on her side, right? She's not really asking Jesus something. She's not really asking whether he cares that she's going to do all this work. I mean, that's how she frames it. But really, she's assuming, don't you care I'm doing all the work? So tell her to do this thing, right? She's assuming something. She assumes that Jesus would take her part once she brings his attention to the situation. So she's recognized him as Lord, and yet she is very confused about how you pray, about how you offer requests. She's confused about why Jesus doesn't set things right according to her own ideas of things being set right. And I think our prayers sometimes are often like that, aren't they? Here's my problem, and here's what you should do, God. I remember I had a friend who went to a Christian college, and he was like 4 or 5 years out of college, and we were having a conversation, and he says, I just don't get it. When I was in college, I went on all these mission trips, and I went on door-to-door evangelism, and now I'm living with my parents, 5 years out of college, and I have this old car, and I work at a mattress store in the mall. And in that conversation, I was like, you seriously think that God owes you something because you did all these things, right? That God, if God would just pay attention to what's going on here, that he would turn it around. Martha gets a very surprising answer from Jesus, and so do we. The problem is, her activities consumed her. The problem is that she was left unable to receive from Jesus. But I think this passage is not Jesus coming down hard on Martha. I think it's more like this. Martha, you're not doing anything wrong, and so you should go feel bad about yourself. It's not Jesus trying to guilt trip Martha. It's more like, come here and sit down, Martha. Receive the restorative companionship of Christ. Sit at his feet and let the things that preoccupy you let go. Let go of them a bit. So Martha needed to make a pivot from welcoming Jesus and getting a meal ready for Jesus to simply enjoying the presence and the teaching of her friend. And I think we too, in our vocations and in our families and in our neighborhoods and even in this church, we need to serve faithfully and also pivot sometimes to those places of quietness and rest, restorative interaction with Christ. But too often we're given this false dichotomy, either or. Either you're out there trying to change the whole world, or you're a really holy person who engages in prayer and worship and quietness and keeping yourself holy. But we have examples of Christians who have put these things together. And I just want to raise a few. One is Thomas Merton, who was a 20th century monk, but also activist for justice. So on the one hand, he cared deeply about the suffering in the world and knew that as a Christian person, he was supposed to care and be engaged. And on the other hand, he lived in a monastic community, and he prayed, and he engaged in restorative communion with Jesus and his brothers. The other is also a monastic person. One of my favorite medieval people, Hildegard of Bingen, who led a monastery in the 12th century. And her life was sort of the same as Thomas Merton's. She cared about the sick. She cared about the poor. She engaged her community in acts of loving service. But she also wrote music and poetry for them to gather and quiet themselves before God and worship. Merton and Hildegard, among millions of other Christians probably, rejected that false dichotomy, the either-or between silence and service. They're both examples of people who rejected the idea that God only wants one part of our life. God wants us to serve with our whole complicated selves. So would we make the pivot from preparation to enjoying our guests? And, we all have different orientations, and some of us are probably tempted to too much service, and probably some of us are tempted to too much pulling away in silence. And we live in a society that values productivity. People feel useless unless they're achieving something all the time. We can't be needy, we can't be still. And I think this can happen to those of us who are strivers, even with regard to Christian devotion, right? That we should spend a certain amount of time every day, that we should read a certain number of chapters, that we should work through devotional texts and prayer lists. And I think those structures are very good and helpful. I'm not knocking them. But they can also become an end in themselves, right? To sit in stillness and not achieve anything. Not a certain number of Bible chapters read, a certain number of prayers, a certain devotional book. To sit and not achieve, but just to be at Jesus' feet. It goes against the grain. And I think, like I said, Bible reading plans can be really good and help us engage with God. It's good to be disciplined. But sometimes these things become stressful. And if this isn't true for you, just don't listen to this part. But for Christians who have been at this for a while, sometimes we stress ourselves out, even with our devotional practices. Just sit and be still. Be still and know that I am God, the psalmist says. While the stuff of life swirls all around us, be still. And sometimes in that stillness, we don't necessarily get answers, right? That's another part of the sort of achieving. I'm gonna enter into stillness until I get an answer, until I achieve resolution. But in 1 Kings 19, we have that lovely story of Ezekiel. You probably know it, many of you, where he does not encounter God in the wind that's breaking rocks. And he does not encounter God in earthquake. He does not encounter God in a raging fire. But in the NRSV, it says, in the sound of sheer silence. Sometimes the silence is the voice of God. Anyway, in the passage, finally, Jesus gets around to mentioning Mary. Mary has chosen a good course, or a better course. The King James says she's chosen a better portion. And some scholars think this is a pun on portion of a meal. Like, here's your portion and here's your portion. That Martha is serving up one kind of meal, and Jesus is serving up another kind of meal. And Mary has chosen a better portion. She's chosen the bread of life. In fact, one commentator calls this story the tale of two suppers: Martha's physical feast and Jesus' bread of life. Perhaps Mary realized that Jesus was offering up something more significant than what her sister was making. Just like he invited the Samaritan woman to a better kind of water. Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet. She's doing that sort of countercultural thing. and Jesus welcomes her, which is a way of saying that Jesus rejected what was expected of her as a woman. And it's funny, he not only rejects what's expected of her, but Martha is actually asking him. I mean, she's probably really busy and she wants Mary's help, but she might also be a little bit uncomfortable that Martha is uncomfortable that Mary might be doing something embarrassing and wrong. Only what men are supposed to do. Men are supposed to sit at the feet of a rabbi, and women are supposed to do the serving. You know, in a lot of Middle Eastern cultures, women don't even eat with the men, right? They make the food, they serve it, and whatever's left over, they kind of eat in the kitchen. So Martha wants help, but she also might want Jesus to endorse the right way of doing things, the status quo, what she understands as comfortable. And Jesus refuses to do that. So here's the thing, when asked to endorse the gender script in his society, Jesus simply refuses. He welcomes Mary's desire to learn and welcomes her posture as a disciple. And you might be sitting here thinking, why even bring that up now? Because those things don't apply anymore, right? Women can learn at the feet of a professor, and women can preach, and all these things. But the idea still holds true, right? That our society and sometimes the church has sort of rigid boxes for us to express ourselves through. What does it mean to be, you've seen those Bibles, right? The quilter's Bible, the golfer's Bible. Right there are these ideas that somehow the faith will be different for people in different places in society. And in a way, that's true, of course. We will express who we are, and we'll express our love for God in ways that are appropriate to where we are. But here's the truth in this passage for us. Jesus doesn't care about those, right? Discipleship is the same for everybody. I raised my kids in a town where most women homeschooled their children. And homeschooling is great. I think for people who make that choice, it can be a lovely thing. But it was very awkward the way that people tried to tell me that I should be doing that. In order to sort of please God, you should be, and if you loved your children, you should be doing this thing. I was like, there's not one right way to be a woman before God, and there's not one right way to be a man before God, right? I think a lot of churches, too, put pressure on people, even with regard to marriage. There's not one right way. If you're married, that's great, and if you're not married, that's great. But discipleship is more important than all those ways that we feel life should go, and that sometimes we assign spiritual value to. And here's the other thing about Jesus welcoming Mary. It's this moment in the story where we've had the hospitality of Martha, and now we have the hospitality of Jesus. Jesus is welcoming this person who used to be unwelcomed, right? Jesus is inviting people who have been shut out to come near. And I think implicitly, Jesus is saying that to Martha, right? He's not just correcting her, telling her to get a life and look at your sister. He's implicitly saying, hey, you too are welcome here. You're welcome to sit here and to learn and to listen and to be in restorative communion with Christ. So the invitation is to her and to all people who are marginalized, all people who are uber busy, even with very good things. The invitation is to all of us, even those of us who are asking, why doesn't God set things right? Why doesn't God set things right in our lives? Fix our disappointments, mend our relationships, give us direction when we're wandering around trying to figure out what our life means. Why do loved ones get horrible illnesses? Why do people lose their jobs? And why doesn't God set things right on the world stage? Why is the avarice of one man who invades a neighboring country allowed to happen in such a way that millions of people's lives are harmed? Why do people with the power to change things prioritize the status quo, which is to say, protect profits for the wealthy, over caring for this beautiful, resilient, and yet fragile planet that we call home? Why are the poor not cared for? Why do children suffer at the hands of adults? Why doesn't God set things right? For me this week, maybe this is true for you, seeing the pictures from NASA, from the newly deployed James Webb Telescope, were really calming. I mean, they're magnificent and they're somewhat eerie. Just to think of the vastness of space and the fact that there's still so much we don't know, there's still so much to learn. But looking at those images puts the wars and the hunger and personal ennui into perspective a little bit. And perhaps that's what Jesus is inviting Martha to, and perhaps that's what Jesus is offering to us as well. Because the work won't end, right? World problems aren't going to go away tomorrow. Racism and sexism and all the bigotries in the human race are not going to be solved anytime soon. World evangelism isn't going to be achieved today. But sometimes we need the perspective, the beautiful vastness of the universe, and the comfort of the one who holds it all, the one who welcomes us in, who invites us in. Ultimately, God offers, and the question is, do we choose? We don't know. It's an interesting thing in the little story that we read. We don't know what Martha does with what Jesus says. Jesus invites her to stop worrying so much and let go and sit down. Jesus didn't force her, and God certainly doesn't force us either. So those of us who are very busy with all sorts of things, even in the summer, family commitments, summer house projects, here I'm sort of showing you what's going on in my life, garden work to finish up, neighbors to visit, and so on and so on. Disease to manage, broken relationships that tear at us, identity theft that leaves us feeling vulnerable, cars that are acting up, grief that colors our days. Whatever it is that distracts, that weighs on us, that keeps us from that restorative communion with Christ. The invitation today is to lay it down. Here is a place of rest, of restoration, of communion with the one who welcomes us in. Amen.